In 1346 to 1343, the Black Death, otherwise known as the Black Plague, swept through the Mediterranean and Europe, wiping out 30 to 60% of the population. The Black Death manifested itself in a swelling of the lymph glands, in violent headaches, in great weakness, vomiting blood, apathy, delirium. And according to contemporary reports, death occurred on the first, second, or at the latest, seventh day. At its height, we hear of 60 deaths daily in Bernay, 100 in Cologne and Mainz, this is daily, a total of 13,000 deaths in Elbing, 2/3 of the students at Oxford died, 3/5 of the Yorkshire clergy. Europe's total losses, according to recent calculations, amounted to 20 millions. It was said that the men of the day found it easier to count the survivors than those who had perished. And so, as we might expect during this time, there was the populations rushed about in terror. So Egon Friedel, one historian, would say that serious people took refuge entirely in their God or their church, fasting, praying, doing penance. The frivolous, he says, flung themselves into a life of unrestrained worldliness, opening all the valves to vice and greed. There was a general feeling of the world's end which dominated and permeated the entire era. And it's roughly at this point, says this historian, when modern man makes his first appearance in the world. And so by modern man, we mean man as he now thinks about himself in the world and as he thinks about the world in general. So if we were to glance back at medieval time for a moment, we would see some distinct differences between the medieval world and the modern world which surfaced. Number one, the medieval person saw a symbol in everything. Everything pointed to something beyond itself. So medieval people saw that everything tangible was evidence of something beyond itself. It was evidence of the eternal. Okay? They had a unified worldview. There was not a secular and a religious. Instead, for the medieval people, everything was religious. Medieval people regarded all phenomenon that could not be explained causally as more real than that which could be explained causally. And so, as an example, St. Augustine would say that I do not seek in order to believe. I do not seek to know in order to believe, but I believe in order to know. Consider this also. To the medieval person, the world consisted of universals. There was a universal people under a universal king who was the Caesar. There was a universal church in the Catholic. There was a universal economy. There was a universal style in the Gothic. There was a universal code of chivalry. There was a universal law in the Roman law. And there was a universal language in the Latin language. And so what this particular historian says is that the modern world sprang to life and the medieval world passed away when the universals, which medieval life was based upon, passed away, or died. So the Roman Empire falls, the Catholic Church loses credibility, the economy becomes localized for the sake of survival, and a firm theology and a providential God who has everything under control is replaced with astonishing uncertainty in the face of a universe that has been dissolved into atoms. Okay? So in other words, there was so the medieval world passes away and the modern world arises upon the earthquake, says this historian, of a whole new worldview, an upsetting worldview that drove people into hopelessness and despair, and then came the Black Plague. So in other words, he would say of that time period that there was first a radical and rapid shift in the way of the medieval world, and then came the tragedy of the plague. Friedel would say that the Black Death was no more the cause of modernity than pregnancy is the cause of new life. Instead, he said a new and uncertain spirit generated a sort of developmental sickness in European humanity, the most prominent of the forms of the sickness being the Black Death. And so to simplify that in one phrase, to simplify all that historian says in one phrase, it's this, that it was not Europe's sickness which depressed their spirits, but he would say it was their depressed spirits which sparked their sickness. Okay? And now, so you don't have to agree with that interpretation of history to be my friend. And I hope I don't have to agree with yours to be your friend. But here's the question, which that interpretation of history challenges us to pause and think about. And that is this. Has our region's sickness, as seen in the heroin epidemic, caused hopelessness? Or has our hopelessness caused our sickness? And so I want to say the answer is yes. Okay? Yes, our heroin epidemic has led many people to a place of hopelessness. And yes, hopelessness has led many people to heroin. But I want to argue tonight, and you'll have some question and answer at the end where you can argue back if you want to. But I want to argue tonight that in almost every situation of life, the intangibles, or in this case, hopelessness, is always primary. So think about it this way. Consider a homeowner, okay? A homeowner does not buy a house and then ask after she's moved into it, what sort of house should I buy? No. Instead, she first dreams up the sort of house she wants to buy and then begins searching for it. And so her house, in this way, begins as spirit. It begins as a vision in her mind, which is not yet tangible, but is not, for that reason, any less real. In fact, unless she first dreams of buying the house, she will never buy the house. And so according to Egon Friedel, the house as spirit is more real than the house as reality because the dream can exist without the house, but the house cannot exist without the dream. In other words, if you take away the house, you can still have the dream, but if you take away the dream of buying a house, you will never buy a house. And so this is true in business. You don't start a business and you have your first transaction and then say, well, what sort of business should I start? No. You start a business in your mind. It's spirit. It's not even tangible. But unless that happens first, the business doesn't happen. Okay? So this is true in business. This is true in real estate. This is true in families. What does it mean for this to be true on the subject we're talking about tonight? I think it means this. It means that if all we do to combat our heroin epidemic in the Lakes region is take away access to drugs. Now, Eric's here. Eric, I want you to keep taking away access to drugs. Okay, we need to do that. But if all we do is take away access to drugs, we can be confident that hopelessness will still be there. But if we take away the hopelessness, it does not follow that drugs will remain. Oh, they'll be there, but the demand will be gone. In this way, hopelessness is primarily real, and heroin only secondarily real to the problem at hand. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to address these primary components of addiction, namely the psychological, emotional, and spiritual components of addiction that's happening inside of a person that drives them to it and keeps them hooked. In the process, I want to offer some consolation and guidance to those of you who have lost loved ones to heroin or who are right now trying your best to help someone who is wrestling with the drug. And then lastly, I want to offer a direction for our recovery efforts, which will lead to hope for our region. And at the end, again, I'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, so understanding the problem from a psychological, emotional, and spiritual perspective. The word addiction comes from the Latin word addicere, which means to give assent to or to surrender. In ancient times, it usually referred to someone who had been enslaved, in bondage, somehow stuck or shackled to something. And I think that definition describes well the state of being addicted. Okay. Lawrence Attera defines addiction as an overpowering, repetitive, excessive need that exists for some substance, object, feeling, act, or personal interaction. One can summarize addiction as a compulsive behavior arising from a compulsive longing or desire. And so the central theme running through all addictions, no matter what they are, the central theme running through all negative addictions is a desire to escape from unpleasant and painful feelings and thoughts. Now, I say negative addictions because people can also have positive addictions. So some people, for example, are addicted to exercise. So a negative addiction is one in which the immediate result is gratification, but the long-term result is pain. But a positive addiction is oftentimes the one in which the immediate result is pain, and the long-term result is health, right? But having said that, even positive addictions, if they become prioritized over other things in life, can also bring destruction in our lives. So the central theme running through all negative addictions is a desire to escape from unpleasant or painful feelings and thoughts. And so it could be to escape from feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness. It could be to escape from societal pressures or feelings of deep remorse. A person caught in the cycle of addiction is seduced into believing. He's seduced into believing that he could be nurtured into feeling better by a substance, or, as we'll talk about in a little bit, by an experience or even a relationship. Addictions help us avoid the real anxieties of life by allowing us to temporarily disengage from reality. So addictions, and all human behavior for that matter, are goal-oriented. Addictions help us get to where we want to go, and for the addict, the place that we want to get to is to a place of painless and happy feelings and thoughts. Okay? So psychiatrist Richard Winter said that the more unconscious, the more repressed the connection is between a person's addictive behavior and his desire to escape from painful feelings and thoughts, the stronger hold the addiction has on him. So say another way, Winter said that if the addict cannot see the goal toward which his behavior is driving, if he's in denial about it, then his addiction will remain strong. And I think that's true. Virginia Larson wrote an article called Games Eaters Play. And she said that addiction is the reasonable consequence of a cultural myth which says every itch deserves to be scratched, every twinge anesthetized, every appetite gratified, reinforced by so much advertising. She says that we have a horror of unsatisfied desires as nature abhors a vacuum. Our inclination and our conditioning is to silence them all by giving into them. Have a headache? Take a Tylenol. Right? Can't sleep? Hungry at 11 p.m.? Order a pizza. Get bored? Download a Netflix video. Okay? And so there's often an unconscious narrative in the mind of an addict which says that pain is not therapeutic, okay? It's not refining or in any way encouraging of spiritual growth, or of personal growth. Rather, pain is a terrible inconvenience that needs to be stopped, not endured for a time. Now let me sympathize for a moment with anyone who has pain. All of us have a desire to, nobody wants to be in pain. I get that. But what Virginia Larson says is the potential problem with a quest for immediate pain relief, aside, of course, from the deadliness of some escape methods like heroin, the problem is that the more habitual our quest for immediate gratification becomes, the less likely we are to engage in concentrated reflective thought about the source and true solution of our pain, and the more hooked we become on the temporary relief which the drug provides. And so, ironically, I'll hear many inmates, 3 or 4 guys over the past year, that have said something like this to me. It's very, it's very ironic when you consider their context. They'll say this. They'll say, that they've never felt better physically and mentally than they do in jail. And for the simple reason that rather than running to an immediate pain relief that drives them further into despair, they have been forced to sit in their pain and reflectively think about the source and true solution to their pain. So our addictions are goal-oriented, and when we cannot see the goal toward which our addictions are driving us, the stronger hold the addiction has on us. There's often a slippery slope of addiction, which addicts experience. And so addiction may start as an innocent curiosity or casual experimentation. And over time, it develops into regular use and into a preoccupation. And so a key sign of addiction is when the person repeatedly seeks the illusion of relief in the substance. And so the slippery slope goes something like this, that there is an experience of painful thoughts and emotions followed by a desire to relieve those painful thoughts or emotions. Having then relieved that pain with the desired substance, they then begin to feel better. But after the relief of the drug wears off, they feel more pain for having acted out, which then reinforces the cycle, and we begin all over again with new and often intensified painful feelings and thoughts. Does that make sense? There's a cycle. Many addicts will describe it as sort of a battle happening within them. They feel, on the one hand, the desire to do good and to be honest, and their apologies to those they love will be sincere. But they also feel this other side of them desiring to do wrong and give in to the negative behavior. And so there is this internal argument which takes place every time the addict wants to use. And the longer the argument transpires in the mind of the addict, the worse they feel for having acted out, and the more deeply seated the addiction becomes. And so they'll say things like this to themselves after they acted out. I told myself over and over again I wouldn't do this. What's wrong with me? Don't I care about my family? Don't I care about my wife? Don't I care about my children? There's this internal battle that takes place in their minds. There are four common characteristics of addiction that I'll describe with 4 Ds. And the first D is this, that there is always a dominating desire or dependency. The desire for the substance can become so dominating and so controlling that it often takes priority over all other life issues. Okay? So it may take priority over eating. That's why people lose weight on the drug. Partly why people lose weight, they lose their appetite. It may take priority over relationships. It sometimes takes priority over paying the bills. It can take priority over maintaining employment. In its darkest form, it can even take priority over the care of children. And so the addictive, dominating urge to use is often so strong that one person described it like a dozen bulldozers moving in unison to run over all my good intentions. That's a pretty strong word picture that describes this dominating desire. Different substances have different addictive potential. So one chart out of a counseling manual listed 14 substances in order of their addictive potential. Now this list is almost 20 years old by now, but here's where it listed it. Okay, on the lowest addictive potential, caffeine has the lowest addictive potential. In other words, those who consume caffeine are least likely to get consumed or addicted to it versus another drug. So caffeine, bottom of the list, then followed by marijuana, then nicotine, then bromides, then codeine, sleeping pills, minor tranquilizers, alcohol, amphetamines, barbiturates, cocaine, Demerol, morphine. At the top of the list, heroin. Heroin has the highest addictive potential. And so the higher the addictive potential, the more quickly our lives will experience destruction as a result of using the drug. So the first characteristic of addiction that's important to understand is that there is always a dominating desire or dependency which takes priority over all other life issues. Secondly, they are delightful. That's the second D. They are delightful. They're pleasurable. Okay? Part of the allure of drugs is the fact that we find some level of pleasure in them, and if it were not so, they wouldn't be so alluring. One addict described the misleading pleasurableness of addiction in this way. He said, drugs make you feel so good, and then you want to kill yourself. It's true. It's true. It's deceivingly pleasurable. Some drugs are excitement-seeking drugs or stimulant drugs, such as methamphetamines, speed, and Ritalin. Other drugs are tension-reducing drugs, such as alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco. And so here's an interesting aside. All addiction, no matter what it is, involves some measure of substance addiction. Okay? So you either give yourself a substance from the outside by drinking it or smoking it or ingesting it into your body, or you produce it from the inside through an adrenaline rush of some kind. And so sexual addictions and gambling addictions would fall into this category, where you produce the desired experience from the inside in an adrenaline rush. Also, important to understand is that all addictions involve some measure of psychological addiction as well, and this is often more important than the physical component itself. So one often becomes dependent upon the ritual more than the actual substance. And so this is commonly discussed when it comes to smokers. Okay? There is a ritual in rolling it and lighting it and puffing it and smoking it and smoking before you go into the store and smoking before you get into the car and smoking before you leave home. And there are certain times of the day when the ritual must be performed. And one sign that a habit has crossed the threshold from a habit to an addiction is when the ritual grows rigid. So for example, the person must smoke or drink at particular times during the day. They will say that they cannot sleep unless they've had some, or they can't go anywhere without having a sufficient supply on hand. They'll often become intolerant of diversions to their schedule, even when close others really need their help. So part of the allure of drugs is that we find some level of pleasure in them, and if that were not the case, they would not be so delightful. Thirdly, so dominating desire, they're delightful. They're also destructive. And I don't need to talk much here about this, but I will say this. That all addictions, positive or negative addictions, will ultimately bring destruction into our lives. Different addictions will bring destruction at different speeds. That's why heroin is so deadly. But all addictions are destructive. And then lastly, all addictions involve a level of denial. Okay? So the addict deludes himself into thinking that he's doing no harm to himself or anybody else. He becomes deceitful to himself or others, sometimes even unconsciously. So for example, he'll tell you he's not drinking while holding a bottle in his lap. They become very creative in hiding their stash. They may hide bottles in the back of the toilet or above ceiling tiles or under mattresses. They may take longer and more frequent bathroom breaks. They'll tell you, I can stop anytime I want. And they do. They stop for about a week, but then they get back into it. They may rationalize their use by saying, everybody does it. Why are you making me out to be this criminal? And they may be right. Everybody they hang out with does do it. They may say, I'm going through a stressful time right now. Or if you had my wife, or if you had my boss, you'd smoke up at night too. And so part of addiction treatment is helping the addict step out of their denial by challenging and debunking their rationalizations. And so our first principle in Celebrate Recovery reads that I realize I'm not God, and I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing, and my life is unmanageable. So there's an admission that I'm not in control. Okay? So 4 Ds, there's a dominating desire, they are delightful, they are destructive, and there's always an element of denial in them.